What's up guys, my name's Stu, and today we're going to be looking at my Torpedo build on the new Tier 6 Steamrunner. That's right folks, the Tier 6 Steamrunner is finally here, and it is good. If you watched my review of the ship's original announcement, you know I was already very prepared to like this ship, and now that I have my hands on it, that has not changed. It has a Lieutenant Commander command seat, making for a good torpedo build. It has an intel seat, which makes for a decent energy weapon build. The ship is gorgeous, and it's a C-store ship, so it's easy to get. Plus, it has a good console and a good trade on it. There is nothing not to love here. Alright, that's enough of me yakking. Let's get a look at the ship. Here she is, the new Tier 6 Steamrunner. I'm using the actual Steamrunner skin on this ship instead of the new Appalachia class. The Appalachia looks great, but I've always been a huge fan of the Steamrunner, and there was no way I wasn't going to use this model on this ship. Since this ship has a command seat, it makes for a great torpedo build, but that intel seat also makes this great for my onboard dilithium recrystallizer setup. But now I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's start with the gear. In the forward weapon slots, we've got what I know Augie likes to call the Four Horsemen. That's the Enhanced Biomolecular Photon Torpedo from the Undine rep, the Delphic Distortion Torpedo from the Lobi store, the Dark Matter Torpedo from the Discovery reputation, and the Neutronic Torpedo from the Delta reputation. These are all here because they are exceptionally hard-hitting torpedoes, but also because they have additional effects, like exotic damage procs or debuffs to damage resistance. The Dark Matter Torpedo also has a 2-piece bonus with its console that gives me additional crit severity, which I am also using. Next is my standard torpedo build setup, the Colony Deflector for its extra crit severity and crit chance buffs, the Competitive Rep Impulse Engine for its speed buffs, the Discovery Reputation Shield for its buff to enemy shields, and the Discovery Rep Warp Core because no single Warp Core is really going to do anything on its own for a torpedo build, so you may as well have the 2-piece with the Discovery Shield. In the back is the Modulating Competition Mine Launcher from the Competitive reputation. The damage these mines do scales up over the time after their deployment, so the longer they're sitting there, the more damage they'll do. And mines tend to do a lot of sitting. The other two are Thoron-infused Quantum Mine Launchers. These have a unstable Thoron radiation proc that does quite a bit of damage. You can find these in the Delta reputation's dilithium store. Now, this ship does come with a new experimental weapon, Hull Spike Battery, but honestly, it still does not compare to Soliton Wave Impeller, which is what I'm using here. Soliton Wave Impeller deals radiation damage that ignores shields, but what makes it so powerful is that its firing rate can be increased with your engine power, so you can get a lot of hits out of this thing. Hull Spike Battery has a cooldown of 5 seconds, and you cannot change that. If they'd lower its cooldown, Hull Spike Battery would actually be worth something, but as it is, Soliton is far superior. Of course, Soliton's downside is that it is only available on an event ship, the Tier 6 Ryzian Corvette. If you did not unlock that ship during the event, the only way to get it now is through Mud's Market, which is unfortunate because Mud's Market is ludicrously expensive. So if you don't have the Soliton Wave Impeller, you'll be fine with Hull Spike Battery, or whatever experimental you already have, just as long as it's not that hyper-excited ion stream projector. I think it's crap. In the devices, first we have a kinetic amplifier for the bonus damage to my projectiles, deuterium surplus for the speed buff, and Kobayashi Maru transponder for the random buffs. Since I have upgraded this to Tier 6X, there is a universal seat, and in it is Lorca's custom fire controls. This is here for its buff to crit chance and shield penetration, and is part of the 2-piece set with the Dark Matter Torpedo. This is also available in the Discovery reputation. In the engineering consoles is really just a bunch of universal consoles, so it doesn't really matter where you put them. First is Tricobalt Terra Launcher, which actually comes off of this ship. Its passives are a buff to mine and torpedo damage, as well as a buff to shield penetration, both of which are very important stats on a torpedo build. The click ability is really nice too. It launches 5 ultra-high-yield Tricobalt torpedoes around your target, each doing an impressive amount of damage and having a 1.5 kilometer radius. Additionally, the explosion will open up an unstable subspace rift for 10 seconds. The rift will have a 3 kilometer radius, will deal kinetic damage over time, and anything in the rift is disabled so they can't just wander out of it. I mentioned this in the announcement review video, but I'll mention it here too. This console is actually inspired by what the Steamrunner did in Star Trek Armada. In that game, the Steamrunner is an artillery unit that fires long-range Tricobalt torpedoes that deal a bit of AoE damage. That inspiration is also why this console can be activated from 12 kilometers away, which is pretty interesting because standard weapons range in Star Trek Online is 10 kilometers. Now over here I have the DPRM because, you know, it's the DPRM, it's the best console in the game, you've all heard this before. But as I'm recording this, I had an idea that I wish I had done before I started working on this. I imagine people who don't have the DPRM often get tired of hearing about the DPRM, largely because it comes from a lockbox ship, the Atlas Prototype Dreadnought, and is thus ludicrously expensive. So instead of this, I wish I had put Phase Space Membrane on it instead. It gives your torpedoes an impressive amount of bonus damage that scales upward over the course of 20 seconds. The drawback is that it drains your auxiliary power over the course of those 20 seconds, and if your auxiliary power runs out, the active ability of the console is cut short. So to compensate for that, I would swap out Kobayashi Maru transponder for a large auxiliary battery. It's a powerful console and is far easier to obtain than the DPRM because it comes off of a C-Store ship, the Grissom, aka the Tier 6 Oberth. So yeah, if you don't have the DPRM, there's an option to consider. Next is Ordnance Accelerator from the Gamma reputation. This is here because it buffs my projectile damage, improves the recharge speed of my mines, but most importantly, lowers the shared cooldown of my mines, meaning I'll be able to launch them that much quicker. Next is Ferrofluidic Assembly from the Terran Task Force reputation. This increases my maximum hull points, which is going to feed into Tyler's duality, buffs my weapons and auxiliary power settings, which normally wouldn't be that big of a deal on a torpedo boat, but this is an onboard dilithium recrystallizer setup, so power is kind of important. But the main reason this is here is because it lowers the shared cooldown of my torpedoes, meaning I'll be able to launch them quicker. Next are my usual low-buy consoles for pretty much all my DPS builds. Bioneural Infusion Circuits because it has the best crit severity buff of any console in the game, and Tachyokinetic Converter for its crit chance and crit severity buff. And the turn rate buff is nice too. In the tactical consoles, first is Enhanced Plasma Manifold. When activated, this gives me impressive buffs to my shields, engines, and auxiliary settings, and is here entirely because of the onboard dilithium recrystallizer starship trait, which I will get to later. This console comes from the Tier 1 version of the Oberth. And finally, a bunch of torpedo vulnerability locators from the Fleet Spire for their buffs to crit chance and torpedo damage. In my specializations, I am using Intel Officer as my primary to gain access to space flanking, and Temporal Operative as my secondary for Entropic Rider. In the personal space traits is my usual torpedo build setup, with one new addition, I'll get to that in a bit. First is Adaptive Offense for its crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back. Context is for Kings for the bonus damage buff when I'm not getting shot at. Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage based on my team size. Innocuous for the crit severity and the reduced threat generation. Inspirational Leader for the chance to increase all of my starship skills. Intel Agent Attaché to reduce the cooldown of my captain's abilities. Resonating Payload Modification to reduce the physical and kinetic damage resistance of my enemies. Self-Modulating Fire for the extra shield penetration. Terran Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff. Unconventional Systems to shave a few seconds off the cooldown times of my universal consoles every time I use a control ability. And this is where things get a little different than they were in the past. You might have noticed I have 11 trait slots now instead of 10. That's because I use one of those elite captain's tokens to gain access to another personal trait. Since alien characters start with 10 personal trait slots, I now have 11. And in that new trait slot, I have added the Boimler effect. With this trait, every time I activate a non-specialist bridge officer ability, I have a 17.5% chance to lower all of my bridge officer cooldowns down to their shared cooldown. If you've looked down at my bridge officer abilities, you've noticed I'm not using an Ox to Bat. That's because this personal trait has basically replaced that cooldown reduction method. On torpedo builds, you can get away with relying on just this trait for your cooldowns, but energy weapon builds will need a little bit more help. I'll talk more on that the next time I do an energy weapon build video. Boimler effect comes from the low-buy store, but can also be purchased on the exchange. In the starship traits is my usual setup for a torpedo build. Ceaseless Momentum from the Knockjudge Intel Battlecruiser. This gives me a bonus kinetic damage buff as well as a bonus kinetic damage resistance buff. This also lowers the shared recharge time of my torpedoes by 1 second. Entwined Tactical Matrices from the Gagarin and Kuj Battlecruisers. Anytime I activate Fire at Will or Scatter Volley, this gives me a free Torpedo Spread 1, and that Torpedo Spread won't trigger the shared cooldown on high yield. Rapid Emitting Armaments from the legendary Dideridex. Every time I activate Tractor Beam, I get a bonus to my torpedo damage, and it fires 3 heavy plasma torpedoes, which deal a lot of damage. Just don't get too close to your target because the splash damage from those torpedoes will hurt you. It is very easy to kill yourself by accident with this trait. Onboard Dilithium Recrystallizer. If you've been here before, you've probably heard plenty about this trait already. Anytime I activate an engineering ability, it adds plus 10 to my lowest subsystem and gives 10% bonus damage per non-weapon subsystem currently maxed out for 35 seconds. This is the whole reason why I'm using Enhanced Plasma Manifold. Its power buffs will help with this trait, ensuring that I get the maximum out of that bonus damage. This trait can be found in the Infinity Lockboxes or the Exchange, but is not attached to a starship, so it's pretty easy to get. Subspatial Warheads from the Sona Intel Battlecruiser. Every time I hit something with high yield, it opens up a subspace tear. These tears follow your enemies around and do an impressive amount of physical damage. And lastly, Terran Goodbye from the Mirror Warship for its stacking crit chance and accuracy buff every time I defeat an enemy. Though if you don't have this, or any of the other expensive lockbox ship traits that I have on here, Piercing Projectiles makes a decent substitute. Anytime you fire a torpedo or a mine, you get plus 200 to shield penetration and hull penetration. And it's easy to get because it literally comes off of this ship. In the Space Reputation traits is, again, my usual torpedo setup. Advanced Targeting Systems for the crit severity. Tyler's Duality for the crit chance based off of my hull capacity. Precision for more crit chance. Torpedo Pre-Fire Sequence for the bonus torpedo damage. And Omega Kinetic Shearing for the extra dot damage it applies to my torpedoes. In my bridge officer stations, first we have the Universal Intel Seat. I'm using Viral Impulse Burst because this actually counts as a control effect, so it's proccing unconventional systems. Having a second intel ability is also nice because of a duty officer I'm using, but more on that in a bit. Override Subsystem Safeties 2 for the buff to my power levels. This is here to get a little bit more help with onboard dilithium recrystallizer. In the tactical seat, first is Fire at Will 1 and Cannon Scatter Volley 1 because of Entwined Tactical Matrices. High Yield 3 to buff my torpedoes because it is a torpedo build. And Attack Pattern Beta 3 for the debuff. In the tactical/command seat, first is Chemosite Laced Weaponry 1. This adds a bit of radiation damage to my torpedoes. Dispersal Pattern Beta to buff my mines. And Concentrate Firepower 3 for the kinetic damage that it gives, the high yield 1 it grants, and for its reset to your torpedo cooldowns. In the engineering seat, since I'm not using Aux to Bat, I've got quite a bit of freedom here. Emergency Power to Engines for the speed buff, Let It Go 2 for the damage debuff, and Structural Integrity Collapse 3 for the physical and kinetic damage debuff. So a lot of debuffing going on over here. And in the science seat, Tractor Beam 1 to trigger unconventional systems and rapid emitting armaments. Since I no longer need the 3 technicians for Aux to Bat, it's opened up a lot of room in my duty officers. First is 27 of 47, who I finally managed to get my hands on. Every time I activate a tactical ability, it gives me a chance to increase my crit severity, and every time I activate an intel ability, it gives me a chance to increase my crit chance. Next is 23 of 47. Whenever I activate a tactical ability, it gives a chance for a maximum hull buff to my whole team, which will feed into Tyler's duality, so that's basically a little bit of crit chance. And activating a command ability will give a chance for more crit chance. Next are 3 projectile officers. The first 2 give a chance for a stacking crit chance buff every time I fire a torpedo, and the third gives the same thing but for crit severity. And the last duty officer is Brad Boimler. Basic torpedo hits have a 20% chance to generate a toxic cloud around enemies. The cloud is half a kilometer in radius and will deal toxic damage over time to any foes within it. Now, the downside to Boimler is that he was part of a promotional giveaway and was only available for a limited time. More annoyingly, he was also only available for Federation characters, so KDF players won't have him regardless. If I didn't have access to this stuff, I would probably use the Emergency Con hologram instead. It lowers the cooldown of evasive maneuvers every time you use emergency power to engines, so you'll get more use out of that. Alternatively, if you want additional help with your bridge officer cooldowns, you can go with one of those liberated Borg duty officers that does that, like 38 of 47. Needless to say, without 3 technicians taking up half your duty officer slots, you've got some options. Now let's move on to the ISE and then the Parse. $440k. Not bad considering the group I was with. You get this much high level DPS into one team and you just end up fighting each other for DPS at that point. I was rather surprised that my mines ended up doing more damage than my torpedoes. I have a hard time believing the passive from the new console is giving it that much of a buff. Might have just been something funny with that run. Soliton Wave Impeller did 34k DPS, that's why we like it so much. The new Tricobalt Terror console did about 7k, which not bad considering I only got to fire it off twice. Technically that's not all its damage because the Unstable Rift did almost 3k. So yeah, that's the build. I hope it helps you in setting up your own Steamrunner, or really any torpedo build. Big thanks to Augmented Dictator Games for setting up this ISE during his live stream. You definitely check him out, though I can't imagine you guys aren't following him already. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. You know the routine, it's YouTube, you've all heard it before, but it really does help the channel, and I do appreciate it. Anyway, my name's Stu, and I want you guys to just take a moment and appreciate the fact that we finally have a Tier 6 Steamrunner in the game. Today's a good day. I'll see you guys next time.